Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's place to hear everything that's happening in politics and public policy right here in North Carolina. We've got lots of details coming just days away from the 2026 primary election. This week, we're talking about that. Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation's Center for Public Integrity is going to be joining us with the latest on what we're seeing in early voting. Plus, of course, Mitch Kokai, senior political analyst for the John Locke Foundation. Okay, let's talk about two major things as we got coming up. One, we've got lots of early voting going on. And then, of course, a brand new breaking poll from Carolina Journal on the latest on what Republican primary voters are thinking. Let's start with the early voting numbers. Dr. Jackson, tell me what you're seeing as we go through this. It looks like Democrat ballots are leading Republican, not too uncommon, but now there's more Republicans, registered Republicans than Democrats, more unaffiliated, registered than all of that. What are you seeing and what's happening so far?
Well, so far, ballots are up in
Right.
early voting. It's about 475,000 so far. An equivalent point in 2022, which is a similar midterm early primary, you're looking more like 370. So we're over 100,000 more votes than at
Wow.
the same time. Now, there's always the question, though, is this more voting or is it just earlier voting?
Okay.
We do know that Republicans have been trying to shift to early voting to try to catch up with Democrats in that regard. It's easier for the parties to keep up, and so they've been pushing it. But the numbers are higher on the Democratic side this time. It was roughly a 50-50 split at this point 4 years ago. But right now, Democrats are up close to 10% more.
Right.
And so there seems to be more energy on the Democratic side, which makes sense because the other big difference is who's in the White House. Right now, there's a Republican in the White House, and that tends to galvanize the party that's out of power.
Right. What does this tell you about enthusiasm? Do you think that means Democrats are more enthusiastic? Our poll is saying Republicans are, but maybe they're waiting till Election Day.
This is a traditional measure.
Okay.
And this has gone in political science circles and other circles, is one of the big motivators for voting is anger and concern.
Okay.
And worry. And I think those are a little more prevalent on the Democratic side right now. And the other thing is there's a difference between self-reporting. I'm going to say I feel very enthusiastic.
Right.
And being actually enthusiastic. And if you've got those things driving you, you're more likely to come out. You're seeing more of that on the Democratic side right now.
Sure. Mitch, what are your thoughts?
To your point about whether this is more people voting or people are just voting earlier, that's something that we really aren't going to know, are we, until the end of the election, when you compare and say how many total votes were there in 2022 versus 2026, what was the percentage, and then you'll know, did people just decide I'm going to vote early instead of voting on Election Day, or if it actually meant a higher overall turnout.
Yeah, that's true. Now, so far, every day of early voting, except for one, has been higher than the equivalent time 4 years ago. So I'm starting to get onto the, hey, this is actually more voting bandwagon. And the only day that was less was the first Sunday, and part of the reason probably was we've had reduced Sunday voting. A lot of counties have dropped Sunday voting. I think we're down to about 8 now that have Sunday voting. And the second Sunday, though, actually was up nearly twice as high. So I think we are seeing kind of step by step that there's more. And so, yeah, I'm thinking we're probably going to see a slightly reduced primary election day turnout compared to 2022, but I think it's not going to be enough to wipe out this 100,000 vote growth that we've seen.
Sure. For either of you, who does that benefit? Does a lot more early voting benefit the incumbent? Does it benefit challengers? Who wins in that situation, or do we even know?
I don't know that it really is clear. I mean, I think this type of election, as Andy's already talked about, is bad for the party in power at the federal level. So you should suspect that Democrats are going to fare better than they would if there were a Democrat in the White House, and Republicans will probably fare worse. To me, one of the most interesting things about the numbers that we're seeing is how they affect probably one of our most important elections right now, and that is the one that's only dealing with one state Senate district, so 1/50th of our state, but it's a district that has 2 counties involved. This is the race where Senate Leader Phil Berger is facing the Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page
26
for Berger's seat. He's been the leader now. He's in his 16th year as the leader, well over 20 years in the General Assembly. Page trying to unseat him. And this is a race that involves Rockingham County, which is both of their home counties, and also Guilford County. And Andy may have some of the numbers in front of him, but at least from what I've seen, the turnout in Rockingham, where Page apparently has been leading in the polling, has been high. The turnout in Guilford has been kind of low, where Berger has had an advantage. And so being able to look at those numbers day to day, how many people are voting in Rockingham, how many are voting in Guilford, is giving you a sense, perhaps, of how this big major election is going to turn out.
Yeah. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I've been looking at this fairly regularly. And interesting, you were looking at close to about 80% of all turnout in that primary was from Rockingham County for the first week or so of early voting. Now, the Guilford County portion has actually caught up, so where it's still more votes coming in from Rockingham over the past week, but Guilford County is starting to pick up its share a little bit. That's potentially good news for Senator Berger. And I think that if this continues through, this may be a sign that, hey, there's maybe more enthusiasm in Rockingham County because both candidates are well known by both sides there. But now kind of the more regular everyday voters who are just, it's a primary, I'm going to vote. So they're just regular folks who are equally represented in both counties are now making themselves seen, heard through their ballots. And that is sort of balancing this out a little bit. Now the question is this trend of the Guilford County portion kind of coming online going to continue, and maybe it'll get close to half? It's hard to say at this point.
Sure. It looks like Rockingham Republican ballots requested is about double that of Guilford, but there's a lot more Republican voters in Guilford. So at the end of the day, it could catch up, right?
Right. Well, and also remember, this district is not all of Guilford. It's a portion of Guilford. It's all of Rockingham and a portion of Guilford, enough to make up for the size of a district you need to have. And the interesting thing for those who've been following the polling is that Page, the challenger, has been leading big in Rockingham, according to the polls, and Berger has been leading big in Guilford. So if Berger is going to win, if these polls are correct, he needs to have a good turnout in Guilford County, where, as Andy suggested, the stakes for the voters aren't quite as high. These aren't people that they deal with on a regular basis as they do in Rockingham County.
And this is such a closely watched race. We can't assume everybody in Rockingham's voting for Page and everybody in Guilford's voting for Berger. So, a lot of the competition and the attention that they're getting is really hopefully pushing people to the polls.
Yeah. And turnout is relatively high if you look at that district compared to others. And so, and you're seeing that across the board, and not just in the 26th Senate district. Like when you're looking at some of the congressional districts, the places you would expect have high turnout, for example, the 1st district, which has a pretty active Republican primary. The 4th district has pretty good turnout. There's an interesting Democratic primary going on there.
The only election where only election where you're seeing really any ads, if you live in the Triangle, is that district race between Valerie Fouché and Nita Alam.
And plenty of money in that race on both sides. So, and another interesting one, the district with the highest turnout so far is the 11th. Now there's several out west, and that's on both sides. There are active primaries on both sides. Chuck Edwards, the incumbent, has Adam Smith challenging him. That district has kind of been a hotbed of challenges for a while. Remember, Chuck Edwards got his seat by beating an incumbent in a Republican primary, Madison Cawthorn. And so can Adam Smith kind of make that history repeat itself against Edwards? It's hard to say. The Democrats also have a pretty active primary. They have an heir apparent in Jamie Egger, but there are several progressive candidates out of Buncombe County challenging for that. And so the question is Egger going to be able to overcome that and make sure he can avoid a runoff?
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Democrats at the national level have already targeted Egger, saying we're going to help him try to flip this seat from red to blue.
Very interesting. Very interesting. It looks like Democrats are getting involved in lots of these races in different ways. We're seeing some new strategies emerge. There's a group called Educators on the Ballot that's putting, folks who may have previously been Democrats into Republican primaries, saying, look, if this is where the discussion is going to happen, it's going to happen in the Republican caucus. We're going to stick some Democrats in there, which is an interesting perspective. They may not align with Republican ideals, but they're in that Republican primary. This is a new strategy. What do you think?
I mean, I really personally don't put much into this effort.
Okay.
I noticed that there are several seats in the General Assembly that didn't have any Republicans running.
Right.
And if they really wanted to advance and say, well, we're going to have this conversation, these are almost all of them safe Democratic seats, so they weren't going to win by nominating a Republican there. But they've only put in candidates where there were already Republican incumbents running in those seats. And they've already opened the door and said, well, maybe in the general election we'll support some Democrats as well. Count me as cynical, but I think this was a way for them to say that they're a bipartisan organization by supporting candidates that they know aren't going to win, so they could honestly say, hey, we backed Republicans. Right. And they are going to turn around and back Democrats in the fall.
Very interesting.
And it might be also the resurrection of the old Rush Limbaugh idea of Operation Chaos. You remember that back when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were competing for the Democratic presidential nomination, Limbaugh was urging his followers, if they had a chance, to vote for to switch their registration to Democrat and vote for whichever one would keep that contest going.
Right.
And so he didn't really care. He just wanted them to bloody each other up before the general election. Didn't end up ultimately working because Barack Obama became president. But my suspicion is it's that same sort of principle at work.
Sure.
Try to muck up the Republican election to help Democrats down the line.
Interesting. Well, we've got a new poll out just today from Carolina Journal. We polled Republican voters across the state and found out a little bit about what they think about going into this primary election. One of the big takeaways I had was that half of the Republican primary voters in North Carolina are undecided about who they're going to vote for in the primary for U.S. Senate. However, of the named candidates they had, Michael Whatley's leading with 38%. So he is far and away the candidate, it seems, on this. He's followed by Brown at 8%, Michelle Morrow, who just jumped in the race at the last minute there, at 2%, and then two more candidates at 1%, including Marjorie Dupree, which we've talked about a little bit on this show. What did you take away from this?
Well, to me, it was interesting because this poll is coming so close to the election day when many of these people presumably have already voted because of the early voting, that 50% of them were still saying they were undecided. Whatley had the clear lead. He's well over the 30% plus one he would need to win the nomination and had a 30-point lead over Don Brown. So unless all of those undecideds flip to Brown, which is unlikely, it looks like it's Whatley's to win. What will be interesting to see is when the final vote totals come out, there won't be any unsures. People will either vote or they won't.
Right.
And so what will really be interesting to see is what is Whatley's final percentage. And the lower it is, I think that's a tougher sign for him about his ability to get that Republican base motivated to support him for what is likely to be the general election campaign against Roy Cooper. Another thing that was interesting to me looking at some of the crosstabs is that if you looked at approval of the job that President Trump is doing, 45% of those who approve of the job that President Trump is doing supported Whatley.
Interesting.
8% of those who disapproved of President Trump supported Whatley. So we know that Whatley is the Trump-endorsed candidate.
Sure.
And if you knew this and you like what Trump's doing, you weren't necessarily all the way there for Whatley, but he had a 45% support there. But if you didn't like what Trump was doing, that had the transitive effect of you not wanting Whatley either. And he was 8%. Don Brown, roughly 7.5% overall. He was at 8% support among those who didn't like what Trump was doing. So he's kind of got about the same level of support regardless of what you think about Trump. And then all of the other candidates, including, as you mentioned, Michelle Morrow, way behind.
Sure. This President Trump approval rating thing has been a big factor in our elections lately. Right here, if we look at this poll we have of Republican voters, President Trump's approval rating among North Carolina Republican primary voters is 81%. The party favorability, a little below that, at 74%, still strong. And 77% of North Carolina's Republican primary voters identify with the MAGA movement, which I think is interesting because, they had a choice between, they consider themselves traditional Republicans, sometimes Christian conservatives, but they identify with the MAGA movement and Make America Healthy Again. That MAHA movement also had 81% support. Does any of this surprise you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we're seeing this kind of identity meld going on with Republicans. I mean, it's hard to say that the MAGA movement is an insurrectionist movement within the party when they have nominated Donald Trump 3 times.
Sure.
And Donald Trump has won so far in North Carolina every time he's run. And so, you can't really pull those apart at this time. It's kind of like we get these changes over. Like we had the Tea Party at one point, and the Tea Party kind of became largely mainstream, as it were. Same thing with MAGA. We may start seeing some splits after the midterm primary when Donald Trump is a lame duck president and people are starting to reposition themselves for a post-Donald Trump world within the Republican Party. But there's really no benefit to being opposed to Donald Trump and being opposed to MAGA within the Republican circles right now.
Sure.
And I think we see this in this primary. Michael Whatley is obviously very well known amongst Republican leadership, but he's a party guy. He's not really comes from an electoral background. He's an unknown. If it wasn't for that endorsement, we would probably have a very close and interesting race here.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're going to probably see at least through the midterm election.
Sure, Mitch. This isn't really a divided base. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about 81% support, 77 MAGA. This is pretty cohesive, high-intensity electorate, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
And to me, among the interesting things you mentioned, 81% Trump approval, 74% GOP approval, and 77% support of MAGA. Among the MAGA identifiers, 86% of them have a favorable view of the Republican Party. So
Right.
it's not a split that there's this Republican Party and then there's this MAGA movement, as Andy suggested.
Sure.
It would be silly to call it an insurrection movement now, since it basically is the vast majority of the Republican Party. Another thing that I found interesting was that the poll asked if you saw a difference between a MAGA Republican and a traditional Republican, and 63% of those surveyed said yes.
Interesting.
So they did see a difference between it. There was, I believe it was 58% of those who identified as MAGA saw a difference, and 85% of those who do not identify themselves as MAGA said there was definitely a difference. So what we are seeing now from the Republican Party, I think, is fairly clear to people on any part of that spectrum is not what you saw from the Republican Party 15, 20 years ago.
But the challenge is then the issue ideology, right? Because there are some splits on those things. Do you think from here on out, and particularly after November, there's going to be some challenges in getting people aligned on ideology?
Well, I think November will really kind of tell an interesting story for Republicans if they experience an electoral wipeout.
Right.
If this ends up being not just a good year for Democrats, but a huge year, do Republicans look at that and say, one option is election was rigged, it's fixed, and all of these results are wrong, Trump won, and all of the Trump people won big? Do they have that reaction? Or do they say, wait a minute, something's wrong here, we need to change direction? Mm-hmm. Or do they say, well, we're sticking with Trump, but after Trump, we're going to have to figure out some other way to go? All of that will really depend on what happens in November. If it's kind of a mixed result where things are good for Democrats but not necessarily a huge victory for Democrats, then I think Republicans will probably not want to change much at all. They'll say, well, it was only because we didn't have Trump on the ballot. We need someone very Trumpy on the ballot, and then we'll win.
Right.
But I think all of these debates are going to be happening for months, years, maybe even decades.
Sure. Let's talk about some of these issues. There was 79% support for Trump tariffs, 79% support for ICE enforcement, favorability of ICE enforcement, and 74% that North Carolina's tax burden is too high. Some of these kind of jar against each other. The idea that they're for the tariffs, but our tax burden is too high. What are your thoughts on that? Where do you think that means people are landing?
Well, I think that means that people believe that they're not paying the tariffs.
Interesting.
It's easy to like a tax, and a tariff is a tax.
Right.
When you're not the one paying it. And we do know that companies absorb some of the tariffs because they know they would lose market share if they passed on a lot of that. But some of that went through. One of the reasons costs have gone up is because we have tariffed products that are coming into the country. Yes, taxes are high, but if you don't believe that they're applying to you, then I guess they're fine.
Interesting.
Again, part of this is that Donald Trump is the president. He was elected, nominated by Republicans. He's the Republican president, and so people are attaching a positive feeling. It wasn't that long ago when tariffs were something that you'd only hear from somebody like a Bernie Sanders.
Right.
And after Donald Trump becomes a lame duck president, I think we might see a reevaluation of these. And certainly, Republicans are not. Even though the numbers are pretty big right now, I think there's an undercurrent of understanding that, hey, this really is a tax and we need to kind of attack this because it is eventually going to come back to us. And I think once you're not physically attaching that to Donald Trump, the tariff numbers, I expect that they'll go down.
Right.
Yeah, a couple of points on this. You mentioned it as Trump tariffs, and they are the Trump tariffs.
Sure.
But the question did not ask that because I think that would have skewed it even a little more.
Okay.
The question just asked, are you in favor of tariffs on imported goods without using Donald Trump's name? And 79% said yes, which suggests that Donald Trump has done a very good job of identifying himself with that Trump, with that tariff issue, because you didn't even need his name for 79% of the people to say that they supported it. But to Andy's point about whether people think they're actually paying for it, it was interesting that in the very next question, we asked, who pays for tariffs? And it wasn't majority, but the plurality answer at 46% was consumers. 46% of people said consumers. 37% said foreign countries or businesses. About 6% said U.S. companies, and then 11% were unsure, which to me, what the interesting thing about this is a large number of these Republican voters who support tariffs also realize that consumers are paying for it, yet still support it. And I think the reason is because they look at Donald Trump's agenda and say, I'm backing Donald Trump.
Right.
I maybe know that this tariff is sort of hurting my family or my business in some respects, but I think as part of the president's overall agenda, it makes sense, and we're going to go along with it.
Sure, and it's not surrender to fine-tune. That's one of the things that we've been talking about, that if you like what you're seeing at the border, you like what you're seeing in law enforcement and reducing crime, increasing public safety, reducing taxes, but tariffs are something that you have a problem with, it might be one of those things that fine-tuning is what's coming in the next few months.
Right, and as you mentioned, there are so many other things for which you could support Donald Trump, and if you support him for those reasons, you might say, I am not as much with him on board with tariffs as these other things, but I'm willing to accept it, and as Andy suggested earlier, that once Trump is no longer the person in the White House, this might be a time for people to reevaluate what they're thinking about tariffs and how they impact them.
This is in the Whatley primary. Undecided voters are more likely to be urban Republicans. I think that was an interesting point, that it shows our, we are very, very blue and very, very red. We're not necessarily purple. And in those areas where you're around Wake County, you might be around Mecklenburg County, the Republican voter isn't so sure that what they're going to do when they step into that voting booth.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It shows you that there are differences among the parties as well. Republicans who live in an urban area are probably more likely to be the ones who can at least deal with their Democratic neighbors and colleagues and have a little bit different stance than the rural Republicans who see what happens in a Wake County or Mecklenburg County and say, this is crazy, we can't have any of that.
Sure. So what do you think the big takeaway is as we head into this primary?
Well, I think the big takeaway, I'll go back to the Senate race, is that when you have this many undecideds this late in the primary, whoever emerges, and it's likely going to be Whatley, is going to be an unknown to the general public. And I think there's a definite vulnerability there. We know that Roy Cooper is going to be raising a lot more money.
Right.
And we saw this with Mark Robinson. Josh Stein was able to define him to the public. And I think we're going to probably see the same thing unless we get some coalescence with Republicans, a lot of fundraising to get a counter message out, because Whatley really needs to introduce himself to the general public in North Carolina.
Right, that's exactly right. Republicans, that base knows who he is already because he was part of the party for a while and certainly was also chairman of the RNC. They know who he is. The general electorate may not.
Yeah, some of them know who he is. I mean, I think that the real insiders, the ones who follow party politics, know who Michael Whatley is.
Sure.
But because he hasn't, as Andy talked about earlier, hasn't ever served in an elected position, no one knows him because of any record. No one really knows what he thinks about particular issues other than what he has said. And he hasn't said a whole lot. Most of what he has said, and I could tell you that the 4 campaign mailers that I've received from Michael Whatley, all they have said basically is Whatley is Trump's guy. Trump endorsed him. And it doesn't say much more than that other than Whatley's the Trump guy and he's going to push the Trump agenda. That's going to get him through the primary and probably get him fairly handily through the primary. But then he really has to introduce himself to the Republicans who don't know who he is and all of those people who are persuadable in the middle who don't know who he is. Introducing himself to the Democrats who are going to vote for Roy Cooper no matter what doesn't make any sense. That would be throwing good money after bad. But he's going to have to spend some time, make some campaign appearances, probably do a lot of ads, explaining who he is and what he stands for and what he's going to support to some Republicans, because there's some who aren't yet on board with him, and also to a lot of those people who are unaffiliated, who can vote Republican or vote for Democrat, depending on what the message is, who are probably, if you would ask right today, would be leaning toward Cooper because they've heard of him and they at least remember him from being the governor and don't know Whatley. So Whatley's going to have a lot of work to do.
All right. I'll be looking forward to hearing more about what he has to say once we get into that primary, because it's going to be very, very expensive, no doubt. Well, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for being here. Of course, Mitch, thanks. I appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on the Debrief. We're going to be tracking the primary election and all those results right there on CarolinaJournal.com. Make sure you subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube and let us know what you think. Comment and send us an email.